Do we notice any problems? Can people hear?
So far, so good.
So far, so good, I'm hearing, and that's good. So let's get started, actually. Well, this is an outline of what I'm hoping to cover today. First of all, I would like to say a few words about why I believe we should prepare our young learners for lifelong learning. I actually believe that their first encounter with the English language, learning English as a foreign language when they're still very young, prepares or offers a wonderful opportunity to help them prepare for lifelong learning. The second one, I'll be talking about what is called the development of cognitive or mental tools. I will elaborate on using stories, not only to teach language, not only to give them, not only to get them to develop their listening comprehension, but stories to get across values to our children. And last but not least, something that I think has a clear link to developing lifelong learning, and that is fostering creativity. Creativity is certainly one of those life skills that are extremely important for our young learners to acquire. I'd like to start by talking very briefly about or asking a question. And this question would be, where do we want to go with our young learners? Watch this video briefly. I'm not sure if it will actually be possible for you to hear the sound also. We are unfortunately not sure about that.
No, that's me.
That's you. Okay, good. But if you just watch this video, it's a very brief video of some children, not in a school context, but in a real life context. Okay, let me play this to you, and the question would be, do we want this? A little problem here. I'll try again. No. Okay, so when I say, do we want this, what do I mean? Well, what we can see here is young learners in a situation of entertainment. They are watching most probably a video where they can maybe see a singer or something, we can hear the song. My answer would be, well, really what we want as a metaphor of the teaching and learning process. There is very clear evidence that children are able to think, to attend, and to remember. But, and this is a key point, their thinking, their ability to attend, and their memory are very reactive. What does that mean? Well, children adapt to the sensory environment they are in. And if this sensory environment, the sensory environment of the classroom, were one that is basically about entertainment, like here in this visual metaphor, where the students watch TV, and this is just an example, which is fast-paced, loud, has lots of movement, colorful images, and constantly changing scenes. Then what we have is we have a kind of almost a sensory bombardment. And when we have this sensory bombardment, kids might have the feeling that this is great because they are getting entertained. But it's very, very difficult in this atmosphere of being bombarded with information, in this atmosphere of being exposed to entertainment, is real learning. Because real learning requires activity. Real learning acquires a multi-sensory acquisition of activation of the learner. Really, real learning acquires learners who take part actively in the learning process and do not just get information or do not just get entertained. In their book Tools of the Mind, a book that brilliantly sums up the work of psychologist Lev Vygotsky, Bodrova and Leong talk about the so-called attention grabbing approach. This is an approach where the teacher tries everything they can to get the student's attention. And this is the teacher at the end of a class. She is exhausted because if all we need to do all the time is grab our students' attention, then teaching is a one-way process. We give energy all the time, but we get back very, very little from our students. This is a visual metaphor of another option. The question is, maybe what we want is actually, and again, I have a little problem, maybe what we want is this. So here what we see is a small group of very young learners exploring something, doing something, and they are actively engaged. They are not just sitting there being entertained, being bombarded with visual or auditory input. They are taking part actively in a process of exploring something. So I'm obviously putting words into your mouths now when I say what we want. I don't know what you want, but what most teachers want is definitely children who are gradually learning. This is not something that works well from the very first moment of their learning process. Children who are gradually learning to direct their attention, to use their memory, and to use their problem-solving skills on their own. In such a learning context, children will gradually, and again, I'd like to stress the word gradually, it's not something that happens from one moment to the next. They will gradually take more and more responsibility for their own learning. Children will become agents of their own learning process, so to speak. They have agency in their own learning process. And this will be, and mark my words here, an educational context where children will be able to develop cognitive tools that help them to attend, to remember, and to think better. I'm coming back to the term cognitive tools in a minute. Bodrova and Leong call such a learning environment or such a learning process learning as a self-directed activity. It's not the learner who, like on a string, is manipulated and entertained by the teacher. It's a learner who has a self-directed interest, who has agency in this learning process. And this is, of course, not something, I've stressed this, but I'd like to say again, that comes automatically. It's something that we as teachers can aim at developing. It's something that we as teachers need to gradually build up. So why would we want to prepare our children for lifelong learning? Well, first of all, we have no idea what tomorrow's world will be like. The only thing we do know is that the world will be different from today's world. So there will be challenges that our learners will be faced with that we cannot prepare them directly for, because we don't know what the challenges are going to be. So we can only prepare them for being flexible enough so they can face the challenges of a changing and unpredictable world. They will need problem-solving skills for that, and decision-making skills as well. School curricula over the world over are not always really preparing for this kind of dynamic and flexible interaction with the challenges of this world. But luckily, we can say that the ministries of education in many countries around the world are actually seeing a need for the development of life competencies, as for example also Brazil with the BNCC. So let's have a look at the second point. Using or developing cognitive tools in our young learners' classroom. What does that mean, cognitive tools? Well, when we think of tools, I guess we normally think of tools like the tool that this young man is using, a saw, a hammer, pliers, a wrench, what have you. We use physical tools because they help us to do physical tasks more efficiently. If we were to drive a nail into a board and we didn't have a hammer, that would be a very painful process. We could try and use a stone, and this is how our ancestors, of course, developed physical tools, but it wouldn't be as efficient as the tools we have these days. So without physical tools, we'd be very limited in what we can do physically. And this is a good metaphor of what cognitive tools are all about, because cognitive tools, or tools of the mind, this is again a quotation from Bodrova and Leong's book, they extend our cognitive capabilities. If a child has not learned to develop their cognitive capabilities, this can actually have serious long-term consequences. Without well-developed cognitive tools, students will not be able to pay attention, for example. Paying attention is a very, very important basic cognitive tool. So, of course, is memory. Without good cognitive tools, students will not have well-developed memory skills. And just one other example, they will not be able to engage in abstract thinking. Secondly, we need to develop cognitive tools because of the importance of divergent thinking. Somebody once said the Nobel Prize winners of tomorrow's world will be the divergent thinkers and not the convergent thinkers. Convergent thinking is thinking like everybody else does, while divergent thinking is thinking differently, thinking creatively, thinking outside the box, as we say. The learner's cognitive and emotional engagement are important in this task of developing cognitive tools. It's not that cognition and emotions are two processes that have little or nothing got to do with one another. We know that the more students are emotionally involved in their learning process, the better they will also be able to remember things, the better they will develop their working memory and their cognitive skills. And of course, if students get challenged and they have to think in the learning process itself becomes more meaningful. It has a purpose, and therefore language itself is more meaningful. This approach, of course, is not just an approach that is useful in the young learner's classroom. It's applicable to any age, really. And here's the good news. I'm not promising a holiday in the classroom. We know that teaching is hard work. We know that we need teachers who bring a lot of energy and passion to the process of teaching English. But if we manage to help our students to gradually develop their cognitive tools, then this gradually also means that the workload of the teacher gets slightly reduced. The opposite would be the classroom where the teacher is like a clown in front of the class and constantly aims at or needs to aim at entertaining the students, because otherwise they would not pay attention. Okay, here is a list of a number of very, very important cognitive tools that students need to develop in the young learners class. They need to be able to compare. I'm not talking about language only now. I'm talking about cognitive tools. I'll give you an example in a moment. They need to learn to categorize, to sequence, to put thoughts and actions into a proper sequence. Imagine a child, even when learning their mother tongue, who have no capability of sequencing. Well, they would, when they tell a story, create chaos that nobody can understand, because if the events in a story do not follow a certain narrative sequence, they will not be coherent and comprehensible. Focusing attention, I've already mentioned this, is a very, very important cognitive tool. The ability to use our memory, so important in language learning. Nobody will be able to learn a language successfully if, for example, they don't have a solid bank of vocabulary, of lexical chunks, and so on and so forth. Students need to learn to explore space, time, and numbers. They need to learn to create associations. That's something that is very, very important for developing what I said, this divergent thinking. And gradually, we are looking at what we could also call critical thinking skills, some more elaborate tools of the mind, not just basic ones, understanding the relationship between cause and effect, being able to make intelligent decisions, solving problems, and creative thinking. This, by the way, if I may, is from a book that I have written together with Marion Williams. The book is called Teaching Young Learners to Think, and it is actually available from Cambridge University Press. Let's have a look at these categories for a moment. These categories of thinking, these cognitive tools. And let me give you an everyday example, a real life example that shows that in real life, we often use a combination of these cognitive tools. Let's imagine I want to buy myself a new laptop. Now, what do we do if we want to buy ourselves a laptop? We either go online or we go to a shop. We look at different models of laptops. There's several. So in order to be able to make an intelligent decision, I need to use various capabilities. First of all, I need to compare various models. What does that mean? Well, I'll be looking at model 1 over here, and I will look at the price, I will look at the RAM space, I will look at the size of the screen, I will try to lift it up to see whether it's maybe too heavy for my trips abroad, etc., etc., etc. So I'm looking at one. I need to focus my attention because otherwise I will not remember what I have actually found out about this model. I need to focus my attention in order to be able to remember the information. So I need to memorize it. I will need to use my memory. And then I will go across to a different model and I will look at this other model. And now what I will be doing, I will be comparing the first model I had looked at with the second model. When I look at the prices and when I calculate whether I can actually afford this model, I will be using numbers, of course. I need to also, at the same time, be aware of my own time. I will not have hours and hours and hours, probably. So you can see how the different cognitive capabilities sort of support each other so that in the end, I will be able to make the decision that makes me happy and gets me the laptop I want for a price I can afford. And the laptop will have the kind of qualities that I actually expect and want and need. Imagine if I didn't have these capabilities. Well, I would just buy one, maybe because it's got a certain logo on the case, or maybe because I think it looks very cool, or maybe because I like the color, what have you. But then later I might find out that it's not actually the laptop I wanted to buy. Let me show you an example of cognitive involvement and cognitive development for very young learners, for the preschool class. So here in this case, it's about exploring shapes, something that is a very, very important cognitive capability. It has to do with exploring space. It has to do with visualization. Students need to get a sense for space, for shapes. So I will maybe use a few cutout shapes, in this case triangles, circles, rectangles, and squares of different colors and different sizes. And then I will get students to have a look at, for example, these images. They are taken from Super Safari. I guess some of you know this course for preschool children. Now I will ask them to look at the first image here, and I will say, after they've learned the word triangles, I will say, well, have a look. How many triangles can you see? And I will use this first image to count together with the learners, and they will use the books and they will use their fingers and they will point at the image and the shapes in the book and will count them together. And then I will say, okay, and now look at the picture again. How many squares can you see? How many triangles can you see? And again, we will be counting together. So the language are learning is important language. The cognition they are developing here is recognizing shapes, which is a visual skill and has to do with spatial understanding. But they will also explore numbers, because when I say how many shapes can you see, how many triangles, how many circles can you see, they will, in this case, revise numbers that they have already learned. And we carry on like this with the other here. So they need to focus their attention. They need to memorize, because if I say how many circles can you see, and I give them a bit of time to count the circles in the next image, if they already forget that, they cannot give me the right number. They will explore the numbers and they need to make decisions. So we have, again, we have an activity, a simple activity that is very useful for language training, train something that is important for real life, and at the same time students activate different cognitive skills. This would be another example for the preschool classroom. Unfortunately, there are some 3-year-olds these days who think all food comes from a supermarket. So this is to help them understand the relationship between different kinds of foods and where they actually come from. So they learn to say, first of all, they learn the words, they learn to say eggs and apples and carrots and milk, and they learn to say the ground and the cow and the chicken, tree, and then they learn to say, well, apples come from a tree, milk comes from a cow, and so on and so forth. And later I will show you also an activity where we can carry this a bit further and students can develop their creative thinking. This would be an example of thinking skills development for the not for the very young learners, but for the young learners classroom. So we have students in a primary classroom here. They've just read a short text about the importance of recycling, separating waste, and now they're looking at these rubbish bins or waste bins, and they're looking at different categories here, different containers, fruit and vegetables. Of course, we don't teach the word biodegradable waste at this point in their learning process, because that would be too demanding. But fruit and vegetables, glass, paper and card, and metal. And now what they do, this is from Superminds, they go to the appendix and they take out some stickers. And so there would be, you know, a banana peel, and there would be some other, obviously, items of organic waste. There will be some empty glass bottles. There will be some old newspapers, etc., etc., etc. So students look at these containers, and they actually stick the little sticker into the container. The next thing would be a thinking activity where they are asked to think of other things, of more things to put in these bins. They will not always know the language, so they can ask the teacher what's, and they will give you a word in Portuguese. They will say what's in English. You help them, and they are learning English for the real world. So we could actually say this is a KILL activity, content and language integrated learning, or as we call it, it's a learn and think activity. And later they produce their own project, they use some recycling bins. Again, let's have a look at the cognitive categories here. They need to focus their attention. They need to memorize things. They need to categorize. They need to understand the relationship between cause and effect. A newspaper that is old will be thrown away. So there is a cause and effect relationship here. They make decisions, and finally, as you have seen in exercise 2 and exercise 3, they will also activate their creative thinking here. This would be another activity where learners learn about nature and about the animal world and how certain animals very, very skillfully actually protect themselves from predators by camouflaging themselves. You can see here again, this leads to a project where students draw a camouflage and then talk about it. What does critical thinking involve? So let's take this a little step further. Critical thinking involves working out whether we can believe what we see or hear. It helps us later on in life to differentiate between fake and real news. It helps us finding out whether something is true. It helps us to argue our case. We will better able to take part in conversations if we cannot just say I like this, I like that. If we are also able to say why we like or dislike something. Critical thinking helps us to know when we don't know things. It helps us to know what we miss in terms of information, and also it helps us to select information for a purpose. This is an activity, I'm sure some of you have come across it from Superminds again. Students look at different invitations for a birthday party. It's obviously a skills page, developing reading comprehension skills. But for a change, we use a follow-up activity, a comprehension activity that is not what we normally find in course books, like a true false or a magic sentence halves or a complete gapped sentences activity. Nothing wrong with those activities, of course, I'd like to add. It's just here what we do is, you can't see the rubric here because I've cut this out so you can see the text better. The task is for students to read these texts and to decide what is missing. So, one of these texts is actually not telling the addressee where the party is taking place. Another text does not give them the time of the party, and another text does not give them the day of the week. So students look at this critically, develop their critical thinking skills because they learn to think about what information is missing. And finally, write their own invitation. And the beautiful thing about this is that when they are now asked to write an invitation for an imaginary birthday party, you normally don't need to tell them anymore. Please don't forget to say when, where, and on what day the party is, because they are familiar with this, because they thought critically about this missing information in the texts here. Stories and the exploration of values. This is one of my favorite quotations from one of my favorite authors, and in this case it's actually an educational philosopher, Kieran Egan, in his book Teaching as Storytelling. What he says is something very, very important. The story is a cultural universal. People tell stories in all countries and in all cultures. And everyone everywhere enjoys stories. We love listening to stories. But, and this is a key point, the story then is not just some casual entertainment. We tell stories not just in order to kill time. Stories reflect a basic and powerful form in which we make sense of the world and experience. Our brain loves listening to stories because the brain wants to know, is there something in this story that is valuable for me? That's why we love reading. That's why we love going to the movies. It's not just entertainment. Of course, there is this strong element of entertainment too. But we learn things from stories, from movies. We also as adults, of course. This is a little story from Super Safari. I have no idea if you can actually hear this now. Do we know, Tiago, if they can hear it?
If you play, they're gonna hear from your microphone.
They're gonna hear it from my microphone. Okay, great. Okay.
Carrot soup. My favourite. I'm hungry. Leo. Oops. Sorry. Sausages and chips. My favourite. I'm hungry. Apples. My favourite. I'm hungry. Cakes and ice cream. Oh, my favourite. My favourite too. Oh no, I'm too full. My favourite.
Allow me a bit of self-indulgence here. I've watched this so often because I often use this in my presentation, and it's always fun in a way to watch this. Children actually love it. So why is this about the values? Well, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that the key point here is important language. There is certain there's a certain lexical set, food. It's about offering food, and it's about accepting food. So there is an important functional language area. But and we will get students, the key objective linguistically is for them to understand the story, and gradually you can actually this story out with your learners. You can reconstruct the story together with them by actually repeating the story sentence for sentence, and gradually students will join in, and they will love, imitating the voices of Leo and Polly and Gina and Mike. And then, when you give them support and you repeat this several times, students can act the story out, and it's lovely to watch their enthusiasm when they do that. And then, of course, there is something else that goes beyond language, and that's got to do with the values or the value in this story. And it's obvious, it's about sharing. Students can relate to that. Children can relate to that. Preschoolers have had experiences of, I don't know, being in a sandbox and the child is playing with some cars or what have you, and the child doesn't want to share the toys. It can be a painful process. So the experience of not sharing is something that they can relate to. And learning to share is something that is very, very important for children. We can talk about this if we want, but very often actually these values are so strong that children understand them just simply by understanding the stories. Here we have a story from Superminds, one of the early levels. I think it's level 1 actually. And here we have the Super Friends. And you might not be able to see these first few speech bubbles well. I apologize for this. So it's the end of the school day. It's been a close day, so they were encouraged by the teacher to bring along their favorite clothes. They're talking about clothes. And then I think this is Whisper, boy on the left here. He says, my cap isn't here. The girls say, oh no. And the other girl says, maybe Gary has, sorry, what you cannot see here is that Whisper actually points at this other boy, and his name is Gary, and Gary is wearing this cap, and he says, Gary has got my cap. And the girls say, are you sure? Maybe Gary has the same cap or has got the same cap. Now, these are the super friends. So each of these kids has a very special ability. So we have Flash, the one of the girls. She's the world's fastest runner. The other one is Misty. She can make herself invisible. We have Thunder. He is extremely strong. He can lift up cars. And then we have Whisper, the boy whose cap is missing. He is the one who can talk to animals. So he runs after Gary. Whisper runs after Gary and says, stop, that's my cap, Gary. And Gary claims it's his cap. So no, it's my cap. So this is the point where we normally, if this happened in real life, we would get a problem. And sometimes kids would get into conflict. They might even become aggressive. They might start fighting, what have you. Now, Whisper solves the problem by talking to this seagull up there on this wall. He says, get my cap, please. And the seagull says, no problem. Now, the seagull, grabs the boy's, Gary's cap. And of course, what we have now is this very strong emotional contrast. So Gary is happy because he has received his cap again, while, Whisper is happy because he has his cap again, while Gary is walking home very sadly, okay? And now, as soon as Whisper gets home, he has the shock of his lifetime because he notices that he left his cap at home this morning. So it's under the chair. And now, of course, he's faced with a situation where he has created a problem. He has blamed his friend Gary for having taken his cap. And he solves the problem in a way that children actually should learn. Problems should be solved. We all make mistakes, but when we do make mistakes, it's about going back and saying, I'm sorry. And this is what he does, and Gary actually forgives him. So this is stories and helping children to explore values through stories. And one last set of thoughts on fostering the students' creativity. So I'll be talking about this for about maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And then there is time for you. We have about almost 10 minutes to ask questions or to comment on whatever you'd like to comment on. So creativity Of course, songs are very important for creativity because rhythm and tunes somehow are very good for our brain. Rhythm is good for the structural thinking in our brain, and good tunes somehow free our thinking. So we have both. On the one hand, rhythm develops structural thinking, and a good song, a good tune helps to foster our creative thought. I'll just play part of this song. I'm not going to play the whole song.
Listen and sing. Hey little clown, are you happy? Hey little clown, are you okay? Hey little clown, are you happy? Are you happy today? No, 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 no. I'm not happy. I'm not happy. No, 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 no. I'm sad today. Hey little clown, are you happy? Hey little clown, are you okay? Hey little clown, are you happy? Are you happy today?
I hope you've been singing along. I have here. Good tunes are important for the development of our creativity, but not only. James Zal, neurobiologist James Zal, says creativity is one of the most valued aspects of a mature mind. And images often are the stuff of creativity. We conceive a new image and suddenly it leads in directions we haven't imagined before. While this song was from Super Safari, the activity that this is a lovely photo of a child actually creating an image, being creative by imagining something. This is an activity from Super Safari still. You remember what we said previously, activities such as apples come from trees, but then students can go a bit further. They can develop collages, they can ask the teacher for words, orange juice comes from oranges, etc., etc., etc. I'll finish with one more activity, which is an imaginative activity, getting students to listen and to imagine and then draw a picture and talk about it or write about it. This is from, again, Super Minds, and it's for primary kids. Let's just listen to this quickly. Promise not to fall asleep in front of your screen.
Student's book, page 104. 1. Listen and imagine. Then draw your picture. Close your eyes. Imagine a robot. A beautiful robot pet. Here's the head. And here are the ears. Here's the right arm and the left leg. Here's the left arm and here.
Okay, I'll stop it here. This is obviously at the end of a unit on the body. Students have learned this lexical set, and they can then draw their robot pets. They can talk about it. They can write very, very short texts. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And this is your time. if you have any comments, if you have any questions, I'm curious to read from you.
We have the first question here.
Okay, the first question. Okay, well, we have a question from Ferdinanda, actually, who is actually saying that she's been teaching for a year and a half now, and she finds it very, very difficult to develop students' cognitive skills. Well, it's a little bit difficult to give you an answer in 1 or 2 minutes, because I also don't really know what the actual problem is that you are, or the problems are that you've come across in your classroom. If I may suggest my book with Marion Williams, Teaching Young Learners to Think. It's a whole book where you have the theory of teaching cognitive skills, but it's also a book of focuses where you have lots and lots of activities for students of different capability levels. There was another question I saw very briefly only here. Yeah, there was a second question. Is that not here? It was strange. How can we catch students' attention? Somebody is saying here. A very good question. I'm currently looking into the development of what is called cognitive control functions, and one extremely cognitive control functions. That's about 3 very important cognitive areas. The first one is working memory. The second one is about inhibitory control, and part of inhibitory control is learning to pay attention. And the third one is cognitive flexibility. There are many, many different ways. The one activity that I've shown you, where students close their eyes and listen, that is a very, very important activity to help them develop their ability to pay attention. Many students these days spend too much time in front of screens, and fast-moving screen images do not always have a positive effect on their capabilities. Silvana is saying, how would you work with children with intellectual disability? Again, this is a huge question, because there are many different kinds of challenges that students might have. If it's somebody, for example, who finds it difficult to read and write, you have a challenge which is different from somebody who has very little attention span, for example. So again, this is something we cannot ask in a general way. Most important thing, and this is where I believe so many teachers are so good at, is to establish very good rapport with the students. Working with children who have certain challenges in their cognitive range of capability, or range of cognitive capabilities, is often about just being a very, very good teacher. It's often about caring and gradually finding out what the problems are and helping a child individually. How can we catch students' attention would be another question that I think I've answered. Which kind of activities can we use so that our class doesn't become monotonous? I think it's a question of working in a multi-sensory way. The more we can engage our students so that all their senses are activated, using TPR activities, where they are not only visually and auditory, but also kinesthetically involved. That is very, very important. Not working on the same kind of activity for too long. I personally, my secret of success when I work with primary kids is small steps, fast pace. You can have the best song. If you work on this song for 25 minutes until everybody in class can sing this song, then maybe the song has already become a bit boring. It's better to present the song and use only a few minutes and then come back in the next lesson and revise it, and then revise it again in the next class, and students will be much better able to actually sing the song in this way. Do we have another question here? Give me a moment. How can we stimulate our learners to speak the language among themselves when English isn't their first language? Yes, you are absolutely right. This is, of course, a big challenge when we have a class of students whose mother tongue is Portuguese, and they all have the same mother tongue, and the teacher shares this mother tongue also. This is a situation where, for the learners, it's very natural to speak their own language. I would suggest that first of all, you yourself stick to English as much as possible. Not always easy in a beginner's class. There I use what is called a sandwiching technique. So when you give an instruction, I would first give the instruction in English, then say the same instruction again in the student's mother tongue, and then say the instruction again in English. So students, in a very natural way, pick up meaning. If you do this several times, then you will actually notice that gradually, like in a sandwich, you can leave out what is in between. You can leave out the Portuguese language. I have recently been working with a group of primary kids, a group of 8-year-olds, and this was in a class in Austria. And it was quite fascinating for me because the kids were really good, but my biggest challenge was that they spoke so much German with one another. So what I did was, and this is an activity, a technique that I would really like to recommend. I took out my mobile phone and I set up the stopwatch on the mobile phone. And I said to the learners in their mother tongue first, look, let's try and set up a new record today. Let's see how long we managed to speak English. And I started the stopwatch, and after 17 seconds, the first child said something in their mother tongue. So I said, okay, no problem. Let's try again. Let's start again. And it was fascinating. It really became their passion not to speak their mother tongue. So at the end of the lesson, our record was something like 4 minutes and 12 seconds. And I put up a poster on the wall and I wrote down our record in speaking English. After 2 months or so, the record was actually 42 minutes. Fascinating to watch that, for example, there were 1 or 2 kids in class whose English was far less developed than everybody else's. So when once one of these kids wanted to say something, other kids said to this boy very quietly, but try to speak English, please. And that boy then spoke English, and it was lovely. So getting them to be part of this process of trying to set up a new record, that's something I would really like to recommend. I think this is where we need to start, because I'm going to give another session at 4 o'clock. We need to change the presentations. I would like to thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. I hope that there was something in it for you too. And thank you very much. Hope to see you again one day in cyberspace or in real life. Thank you. Bye-bye.